of Contemporary Art, and I am delighted to welcome you here tonight for a conversation with Donald Sultan. This program is in honor of his exhibition, The Disaster Paintings, which I hope you've all had a chance to see or will see soon tonight, perhaps in short order. The disaster paintings make up a singular and remarkable body of work. Sultan began the series in the early 1980s and continued with it for nearly a decade, taking images of actual events drawn from the daily newspaper and transforming them into large-scale, heavily wrought monuments to industrial devastation and environmental catastrophe. In Sultan's hands, news photos of forest fires and freight train derailments are memorialized in linoleum, masonite, and tar. And here you get a sense of the physicality of these works, which you can see. One of the most perceptive things I've read about the series comes not surprisingly from the artist himself, who noted that key to the way he works was to use the heaviest materials he could find to make air. I love this formulation, in part because it's true, and because it's a wonderfully simple description of his painting's central irony. But it's also cleverly disingenuous, eliding the basic fact that the heavy materials he uses are of a piece with their industrial subjects, and point to the tenuousness and vulnerability of the most progressive aspects of modern culture. The paintings rope together ideas of progress and decay, the future and the past. They also represent an art historical tour de force, merging the materials of minimalism with representational painting, high culture with low, and figuration with abstraction. They are at once very specific renderings of individual traumas and generalized representations of dread, a combination that allows them to reach well beyond the time they were made and resonate exquisitely today. The exhibition we are celebrating is the first to focus on this series. It was organized by the Modern Museum of Fort Worth, and their director, Marla Price, as well as the show's curator, Allison Hurst, are here tonight. I'd like to thank them for their great work in bringing these paintings together. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Brune, the Gene Davis Memorial Fund, and the James F. Dicke Family Endowment, who have generously supported the exhibition's presentation here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And most of all, of course, I'd like to thank Donald Sultan, who is the reason we're all here tonight, and whom I really don't want to take any more time away from. But before he comes up, I want to quickly mention a few more things. First, I'd just like to ask everyone to silence their cell phones. Also, after our conversation, we'd like to invite members of the audience to ask questions as well. And if you would like to ask a question, please go to either of the microphones on the sides of the auditorium in the aisles. This evening's program is being webcast, and we'd like everyone at home to be able to hear the questions as well as here in the audience. And finally, after the program, we'd love to invite everyone to an exhibition viewing and a reception upstairs in the Luce Center. You'll be able to identify our guest of honor by a boutonniere, I believe he will be wearing. Maybe not. I was told he got a boutonniere. Well, you'll recognize him anyway. So please welcome Donald Sultan to the stage.
You want to take that with you, or you don't need to?
Oh, good idea. So, can everybody hear me? Yeah. So I thought I would begin somewhat at the beginning and talk a bit about the first paintings that you made and that I guess were retroactively considered part of the series. Like this painting right here, Forest Fire, June 28th, 1983. What was in your mind when you wanted to paint a forest fire?
Well, I had been doing paintings of industrial landscapes and factories that were more hard edge. And I had done smokestacks with fire coming out of the tops. And I called them urban flowers. I saw a bunch of them when I was in Chicago at Gary, Indiana, in the steel mill. So I came acquainted to rows of these fires coming out of the stacks. And I started to work with landscape too. I had begun to see cypress trees as architectural nature because they were topiary. And the first one I used, which was in the middle, was really taken from a Da Vinci painting called The Annunciation. And it's a little spindly pine that's been shaped. And the cypresses were trimmed. So I made one like that plain. And then I thought, well, why don't I set it on fire? So I carved out flames, which I had drawn, and I thought I painted them with watercolor because I was doing the fire out of these tar industrial smokestacks with watercolor because I thought I want to keep a paradox between fire and water. So I started with this way, and I believe that there's a bigger painting in the show.
That's right. Yeah.
That's sort of like this painting. And
There
it's
it is.
almost the same structures, but at that point I started to wash them with industrial solvents to get smoke because I wanted to enliven the whole thing with the fact that it was burning. When I started doing these, whenever I would paint the fire, I did them by making a cartoon on the panels, and I would paint the black areas in with black paint, so I knew what I was going to cut out for tar, and then I would paint the yellow on, and I would make the sound of wind blowing as I did it, like a kid makes a machine gun when he's playing with his kids' toys. And so I would get a rhythm going with painting. And some of the early ones before I started to wash it would be looped because I wanted to put the juxtaposed hard edge use of the black trees with the gesture of the yellow fire so that we would have chaos and we would have a more sturdy image to hold it. So once I started cleaning off the tar and started to make this kind of smoky, sooty, activity over all of it, I began to really get into the idea that now I was really able not only to capture a kind of movement of the fire, but I could add onto it the kind of wind, that's the turbulence of a gesture that wind acts on. So that's part of what you had said before, where I would take these heavy materials to also add air. But I also wanted them to get flat, and I wanted them to be abstract. So I wanted to have an image and a gesture put together that would be hard to penetrate. So these are mostly flat with no perspective. And there's always the black trees in the front were meant to be blocks between you and the spread of the fire. But on this one, the fire has moved forward. So that's kind of how I started with it. The one that you showed before this, which you skipped, called Battleship. This came after the first forest fire, and I had been using, like I said, smokestacks, which were shaped like barrels. And the colors were gray, like steel, tar, and yellow flames. And I thought at that time, we started, the American Navy started to shell Beirut from the battleships 40 miles away. And I thought, the shells from these ships are the size of Volkswagens. So it's made me think of making the smokestacks into the battleship guns and use the colors which came from Goya from the 3rd of May, which is the one where you see the Napoleon's troops shooting the Spaniards up against the wall, and carry it through to Manet's execution of Maximilian, which removes the victims in a hail of smoke and you see just a mechanized soldiers firing squad, to this one in which the victim is invisible, but to keep the look of the flame, the executions. So all of the paintings that I was involved in and still involved in have references to other paintings and other masters, other forms of art, in addition to the addition of what each painting means.
It's interesting that like this sublimated art history into these very refined forms.
Well, the structures themselves come from more or less insight, site-specific works, which people like Gordon Matta Clark had cut through the floorboards of buildings to look all the way through. I decided to lift those cuts up and put the floor on the wall. So that was a reference to that kind of work, and use honest kind of cheap industrial materials rather than say fine art materials or oil paint at that time, to sort of tie into arte povera as well, and also to make every aspect of the painting an industrial creation. And by doing that, the imagery reflects back on the structure that I make, so that the weight and the physicality and the strength of the structure represents the strength of the architecture, which on the surface you see dying. So there's the paradox work that way as the water to the flame.
So these first couple of paintings that you made, sorry the images are not great, they're sort of a bit atypical when you consider the series as a whole. They're either vertical or horizontal, and then they kind of settled into this dirge of,
That's right.
of 96 by 96 square.
Well, I did a series of seascapes, which is where this kind of came from. And at this time I made my stretchers. They were fairly complicated. I made them myself in the studio, and I did pictures more or less from a window. It was a play on the inside and the outside. And the way one sees buildings in New York is through a window, so I made them half of the painting would be cut in half. So you'd only see a part of the image shoved in the corner. But these things are hard to imagine, but more or less, the seascapes, the back of them were made out of rockers that I would make out of wood so that they would rock like you were on a boat. And this one is horizontal, and it's on a rocker. So you can look through it like you look through the newer ones on the side with the pipes, but you see this rocking structure of wood. And so it sits slightly askew on the wall as if the ship would recoil from the fire.
They're so physical.
The only thing I left out of here was the smoke rings that you see when they fire those guns, which I later on revisited smoke rings, but I didn't put them in front of the guns.
So when you were making these early ones, did you have a sense that they would grow into this, this series that consume a decade?
No, you never know. I've always thought, when I was in college and graduate school, I was doing abstract paintings on the floor and then one thing or another, and if somebody would have said you'd be making paintings like this, I would have laughed at them. I would have said, no way would there ever be any recognizable image in there. And but it led me to this. I mean, like I said, paintings talk to you. They talk to you all the time, and they tell you what you have to do next. So pretty soon you find yourself in a world that you're working on, and it's a compulsion, more or less. I mean, I don't just think them up. I discover them in the work that I'm doing.
You spoke a little bit about this just a moment ago, but one of the things that's obviously so distinctive about them is their use of materials, the masonite and the tar and the linoleum. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where these materials came from and how you see them relating to what they're representing.
Well, there's a lot of baggage in there. The simple story is that I made some linoleum paintings and I put them on the wall. I used the black glue that you use to lay them on the floor, and when I put it on the wall, the tile fell off. So I thought, well, that's not going to work. So I glued the tiles down with contact cement. And then I found roofing tar, and I put those over. And so as soon as I did that, and I started to work into that, like these with you have this sooty thing, I started thinking of Flemish painting and the black backgrounds of some of the 1700s pictures, and how the use of bitumen in oil paint was a major factor in French and Italian painting. In fact, the Raft of the Medusas has the whole center of it is bitumen, and but they use the real tar base, and so it never dries. So over the years, it slips down, and every maybe 25 years, they have to take the painting down, turn it over, refit it back up again. But these things dry because they're made out of kind of a vinyl butyl rubber. The original ones that I did that are sort of sooty and sepia are asphalt-based, and the others is the butyl rubber. So they changed the formula on me while I was working on them, and I had to adapt to different imagery. But the funny part about doing it is when you're spreading all this tar in your studio, you start thinking, I'm going to discover Jimmy Hoffa. This is where he is. He's in one of these vats of tar. But it started to make me think, which led me to the still lives and the florals, because of the black background. The first one I think that I did was 8 feet. It was just 4 panels of this black, perfectly spread tar, and it looked like a cow's hide. So I did a huge crayon drawing of a steer, and it was on a kind of diagonal, right on this thing. So there was only the outline, really, of the steer. And people came in and said, well, that's, very macho. And I said, no, you don't understand what a steer is. It's, well, most of you know what a steer is. It's the opposite of that in a way. But almost all of the works that I was working on were about industrial production. So this was food. And the lemons and things I used were the standard genetic altered, I don't know what you call those, like sun-kissed lemons or whatever they are with a little sticker on them in the supermarket, where all of them are uniform. So everything was, more or less made from the materials to the imagery. I did a number of steer paintings like that. And then I started moving into sort of changing the drawing from a steer to a person to a silhouette. And then those things merged with these things. So everything kind of came from different angles.
And the masonite, is so interesting as a material because it creates this inherent grid that you're working with in that.
Well, industrial materials come in 4x8 sheets, plywood or masonite. The linoleum was in 1-foot squares. So the simplest thing to do is just to use them like that, to just use the standard material. So you'd have a 1-foot little painting or a 4-foot panel that would become an 8-foot panel, or a 4x8, a 6x6, just a standard of that. And one of the things that is so interesting about it, I was talking today in the gallery, that one of the reasons these paintings look so good in these galleries is because these galleries and all these buildings are made out of standard building material sizes, whether they're larger or smaller. So the scales always settle in almost like they were made for each other. And it's like that in every building. And so a lot of times, the first show I did of these paintings was in Chicago when I had the first touring show at the Old Museum of Contemporary Art, and the floors were green linoleum. So it went right with the green linoleum painting that was in the show.
I love this. This is Venice Without Water, where you can really see the linoleum kind of peeking through.
Yeah, this one has no yellow on it because I wanted this painting. This is when the canal's drained because of some quirk of the industrial park. When every now and then they do something down there that impedes the natural flow from the lagoon into Venice. And usually it floods, but this time it took all the water out. So I decided with the Rialto Bridge, and you could see everything without the water, and I decided to make it, the paint resemble tears. So I wanted it to look like it was just all dissolving downwards. And so with the yellow, it would have a different kind of life to it. So also this was the new tar, which was more rubbery, so instead of having sepia, it would be gray. So it worked beautifully with this paint, this blue paint I had made to resemble blue linoleum as well.
I think I remember reading something you said a while back where you said that linoleum is just kind of code for a landscape of the interior.
Yeah.
Because you see this blue and you've seen it a million times before, so it immediately puts you in mind of these kind of standardized
linoleum
buildings.
was our modern interior landscape. Originally, linoleum was meant to be fake marble. And so that's why you had these striations. And then after they did that for a while, they decided, well, since it's not marble, let's just do it any color we want. So some of the earliest linoleum, the 9-inch squares, I just put together and I had a seascape. I'd have a greenish thing here and a blue thing down here, and it looked like water. You know, like these rocks you might find that they polish in Italy and they look like little landscapes. So it was just linoleum. So a lot of the seascapes were just two kinds of linoleum put together, because with the movement of the striations in the linoleum, it became the sea or it became something else. So I used it as sky and grass, and almost all of them, the blue linoleum was the sky.
One of the things I think that's so kind of compelling about the works is that they managed to be both very specific and very generalized at the same time. And I think part of that for me is the fact that you often put the viewer directly in the midst of the scene, so that the details are very apparent and you can see what's going on, but at the same time it's also very confusing. You're right in the middle of the action, so it's difficult to get a perspective. And I'm wondering if that's a specific strategy of yours and how you think about that.
Yeah, it's another paradox, because I want to have the viewer in these fire paintings. I wanted to put something between you and the actual fire, like I did with the cypress trees. And I picked an image which I thought I could make kind of look like a cypress tree, which was a fireman, because of the shape of the figure. And I wanted it to be generic. I wasn't making portraits. I wasn't making a statement about particular firemen or the role of a unit of firemen or anything like that, but just the symbolic use of firemen. And by doing that, and to make it thick and rough and tumble and kind of hard to enter and yet easy to see, so it was kind of like, what is all the things going on in there? I also had the idea, basically this is a very controlled painting. So I wanted a controlled painting to be also chaotic. And I wanted it to also to give you the impression of chaos and being present in something that's dynamic. So it was kind of, that's always played in there. And in the meantime, there's references to balconies from Manet and Goya, and all the steel from 19th century use of turning steel into decorative objects, now melting, and all of these things are put in there. So to answer your question, I think it's yes. I mean, that's the simplest answer. But.
I guess, part of that is expressed so wonderfully through the grid that's the structure for all of the paintings. So they've all got this incredible stability and sense of order to them that you're
Also,
disrupting.
in order to cut out the images, I have to use blowtorches. So we're actually using fire to make the images. And they melt, and then the solvents melt the tar into these bubbles, and then washing it off gives you the colors that blend with the yellow and the blue and give you the landscape and the activity of something dynamic going on in there that's flat.
That sort of push and pull and that sense of chaos and order is something you were talking about earlier today that you personally experienced when you were just a few blocks from the Twin Towers coming down. Is the sense of being in the midst of something chaotic.
Well, I say to people that the further away you went from ground zero, the more frightened people became. when you were close to it, it was just kind of hard to get your head around what was happening. So you were there, and you could see the results, and we all left. We had to evacuate. But I often tell people I'm just still in denial. I just don't think it happened. But the further I would go away, if I was in Michigan or I went to California or in the Midwest, the fear of what had happened seemed to have gripped people in a much stronger way than the people who were there living it. And I think that's probably true. I mean, once you're in the middle of something, you don't have time to be frightened to death of it. And then once it's happened, you have other emotions other than fear because you've seen it happen and you've been there. But fear has its own life, and it's quite powerful. So I just sort of felt like I'd like the viewers to be present when they see these pictures. They don't have to be afraid. It's not about that. It's not about being afraid. It's about thinking about what happens when these kind of things happen. And the majority of these kinds of disasters in the show are more about what happens after the disaster, not actually the disaster itself. So that the train wreck with toxic chemicals, you don't see the results of that pollution and that acid on people who breathe it. You didn't see that once the towers went down, all the people who got cancer later on. These are results of things that are beyond the event itself. And most of these pictures address that kind of system.
Go back to this for a sec. Just kind of putting together some of the things you're talking about, your materials and the sort of very untraditional materials for painting, yet you're still making painting, which is a very traditional medium or genre. You're including all these references to art history. And in a sense, you're kind of working with the most traditional form of painting. You're making history paintings, really. You're taking current events and memorializing them in this grand, kind of monumental form. So I'm wondering how you see yourself in that, grand tradition, really.
Well, that's a sort of an interesting question. I don't know if I think about that much. I make the paintings with these materials because I think that all materials now are manufactured, and I thought that these were just less expensive and gave me a better grip on it. But if you want to go into talking about painting in that sense, you go back to the cave paintings, what materials did they use? And brushes were made out of horse hairs, and these things are part of and parcel of painting. And almost all paintings, in a way, are history paintings. I used to give a lecture on how painting evolved as the technology evolved for being able to paint. So that cave paintings, while a rough surface would give you a certain kind of a way to work, and then when you could have panels and you could have oil paint with the invention of that, you could do finer things, and then with the invention of being able to put geometric perspective in, you would have something else. And so the history of painting is filled with every generation adding something to what they know from before. And so Pollock, in a way, really, if you think of most painting up to Pollock, were windows, more or less. Surrealism was a window interior, and most of American paintings, rural paintings or landscape paintings, were windows that you looked into, and he just smashed the glass. And I always said that Duchamp, his work, the bride stripped bare by the bachelor, even on the glass panel, it would have been more radical if he'd have left it like that. But when it broke, it was finished for him because he was a cubist. So it made more sense to say once it broke, that was, satisfying somehow. So we all have these. Everybody's trying to break through, in a way, the window concept of art, and have done it more or less successfully, I think. So now we move on, trying to find another way to say things that are important, but knowing what we know, we can't possibly make something that's old-fashioned. So even if you have a person who paints very realistic portraits in the style of, say, a Flemish painter, you're never going to mistake it for a Flemish painter. This is not possible. And that's sort of one of the interesting things about the touch and the way you approach art. So I did want them to be, in a way, history paintings, like I wanted to bring back when I started these landscape, still life, and florals. I wanted to bring that back into the abstract image of art, which nobody was really doing that much. There were a few people that were sort of playing with that. Richard Archwager was playing with that, and Oldenburg to a certain extent. But so I wanted to join the crowd, more or less.
So how do you contextualize yourself? How do you see yourself in relation to other artists or other painters working at this time in the 1980s?
I don't see myself as related to them, really. I had this sort of contrarian streak that I've always had, even as a kid, which made me fairly less popular than other kids. But when people asked me when you would give lectures or something like, well, how do you choose your subject matter? I would basically say, well, you look at what everybody else is doing and then don't do that. And so that's kind of what I did. And what I still do, I think what I do is still doing that.
One of the things, well, one of the things that's also interesting, I mean, having spent time with these things, I can kind of, you see the relationships between the different aspects of your work. But for people coming to it who aren't necessarily immersed in it, it seems like you have quite distinct tracks of your work. You have flowers and fruit. I'll just show a few of these things. Still lives, as you were talking about. Is your
you can stop
lemons,
there for a minute.
Your
Just
black
leave
lemons.
that up.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see them as kind of interwoven.
Well, I saw them as, the simplest answer is that I approached making imagery the way one would live. You sit at your table, you have a bowl of fruit, you got some flowers on the table, you have the newspaper with this catastrophe in front of you. And so I just worked on those three things. That's basically what I did. And I added things into it. When I made these still lives, I painted a lemon black, and I would buy fruit at a market and stuff and put it together and put that in the middle and take a flash with a Polaroid, which was already then square and black around the edge because the flash would only illuminate the image. And then I decided to put eggs in it. These are all, using an egg is pretty historical. That goes back to, Christian painting. And I wanted to put a white egg in there, make a white void rather than a black void. And but I couldn't find, it was in France, I couldn't find any white eggs. So then I had to paint the egg white. And I was in Chinatown, and I went into a store, and they had 100-year-old eggs, which were baked in this black earth. And I thought, well, that's great, too. So then I put black eggs in there. So those were basically to be a weight, to be part of a still life, and again, the paradox of weight and void, and life and death, because the black void really could be anything, but it sat in there with the fruit. And they were all painted together, and pretty gestural, really. I wasn't really trying to render them as per se to be like really apples, because I thought, I'd rather than, if you make an 8-foot lemon, I didn't want people to think, gee, that's a big lemon. I mean, the mind actually then reduced it to a painting, right? So once I realized that it wasn't going to be just a big billboard, it was kind of, opened the road to do a lot of that kind of thing. And with the, so you have the gestures of the painting of the, I basically rubbed off the tar and everything off the fruit and gave it whatever shape it had. so in the same way I made the landscapes, and then same thing with the flowers. And so they all have a tie-in together. And at one point I showed them all together, but then over the years I ended up sort of more or less doing them more thematically.
There is a painting, these are dominoes, and the smoke rings, which you were talking about.
Yeah.
There's a painting, here it is, which sort of combines them very directly.
Yeah, this was, actually, I really love this painting. This was a painting I was making in France at a studio that the Beaubourg gave me in 1993. And I decided that I wanted to do something with the flowers in a pot, the oranges in a pot, things I've been working on. And I wanted to combine it. So I had a big silk screen made of a ferry boat disaster, which is a disaster painting, which is at Smith College Museum now. But I had the screen. So I decided that I would make it as if I was going to make flowers in a pot, but I would screen the ferry disaster on the pot. And I wanted to say that even the worst, most horrific events, somebody can co-op into a flower pot. And then I made the oranges stuck in there and did them sort of the way I did the disasters. And this was really the last flowers in a pot painting. And after that, there were more disaster paintings that I made. And so it was the real culmination of the two.
And so then at some point in 1990, I think it was, you just decided not to paint any more disaster paintings.
No, I think I made, I can't remember when I exactly stopped, because I did a few a little bit later. There were birds, out of control bird paintings. In fact, I still do some now. I've done a series of small dead birds and bees. And actually the next one's a small, beached whale.
More organic.
Yeah,
more organic
but still, something that's, happening that's inexplicable and disturbing. But they're small paintings. They're not big paintings. And I guess what happened is I got distracted. I started doing dominoes, and I started doing different kinds of, taking the flowers out in different ways. And I got distracted by different ideas. Like I said, you find ideas in your paintings, and sometimes they run away with you. And you just start going in all kinds of directions, which I did. But mercifully, when you're painting like this, you can only go so fast. So I had series of these things, and they kept growing in different directions. And I didn't go back to doing the disasters because, in a way, when I made these fireman paintings, and I've had firemen actually come up to me and say that nobody's ever captured the feeling of being in a fire like that. And but I did not know when I made these paintings in 1985 that firemen were going to become the symbol of all that's great and wonderful in the world, and we should be celebrating it. And there are images everywhere on calendars in their underpants. I never thought of that. And when I did the shelling of these places, like I did the shelling of Basra, which you see the people ducking from the explosion, these were the Iranians firing on it. And I never thought we would be in there, And so the disasters of these works overtook my ability or my interest in making paintings about them, because there was just so many images of it already. And it overwhelms your daily thoughts. So I thought I'd make flowers. I mean, why not? Because, why shouldn't you be cheered up sometimes, So I started doing things that were, a little more heady, maybe a little more conceptual, instead of putting what I'm doing now. I don't know if you have any pictures of some of the newer ones. Yes, a button, say. Do you have the Mondrian? We'll put that one up. Yeah. So I decided, instead of putting the disaster painting on the pot, I would take the symbol of American modernism and make it a shirt and stick a button on it. And that's what that is. So that's what I've been working on now, sort of the merging of art and fashion to a certain extent. But also instead of the lemon, I'm using this heavy black button. But I polish these buttons with, it's just oil paint, but we polish it with sandpaper so much that it looks like it's vinyl. And I wanted it to have the feeling of an actual plastic button. So I've been working on taking the hand out of making the flowers and making them totally artificial. And that's what I've been working on now.
And is that something that are you directly influenced by Warhol, or is that?
I have nothing to do with Warhol. I like Warhol, but I'm not a pop artist. In fact, some of the ones that I did, do you have one here that's one of the multiples of the flowers? I don't know what you had here. Let's see. No, but I've done some colored ones that were a flower that went in multiples like that. And somebody said that was kind of like Warhol's, and I said, well, it's also like Kelly. I mean, this is it was a color chart of all the colors available in flocking. I was using flocking because of like a shirt material. And so, anything can be like anything, but if it reminds people of some other artist, it's fine. I've used Manet, I've used a lot of people, I've used Ryder, I've used Turner. I mean, some of the Polish landscapes are like Turner. I've used a lot of different a lot of different influences when I'm attacking a painting, and I do it on purpose. I did stacked Chinese vases, which I thought of as Brancusi's, and also Barnett Newman. I make references to a lot of different art in a different kind of way of doing it, and it's part of the continuum that I like. Because, I figure as crazy as I can get, it's going to have grounded. It's grounded in art history. And I think that's a worthy history, and probably, as far as I'm concerned, the most important history we have. I don't think anything has the power of a painting except a painting. And that's what I think, so I'm not too concerned about what other people are doing.
Well, I think that is the perfect place to open it up a bit to some questions from the audience. So if people with questions would like to go to the microphones.
If you don't have any questions, then I've really done a good job. You should be totally at loose ends here.
So are you going to continue in this theme? Because today, President Trump has signed or said that he is going to withdraw us from the Paris Climate Treaty, which is probably one of the greatest disasters that is going to occur in modern times. I'm wondering if you were considering reflecting on that in your art.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I had a discussion when this show opened in Fort Worth after Miami. When I opened it, I had the German consul come up to me and say, "Why did you use Auschwitz?" And I said, "Oh, it's Auschwitz in 1985. It's a picture of it where the Carmelite nuns had moved into it, and they wanted to make it a museum, and they wouldn't leave. So I thought, well, this is an interesting dilemma. So I painted the picture of the dead Auschwitz with the Carmelites in there. And so I said, so it's not, it's really Auschwitz now. It's not then, but why wouldn't I use it? He said, well, you should do a painting of Aleppo. And I said, well, there wasn't any problem with Aleppo when I made these paintings. But there's a lot of pictures of Aleppo. I don't know if I could add anything to it. But then I thought, well, maybe if I went back to it, which would require quite a turnaround, like turning around a fleet, I have pictures that I've been saving of images of cities that are obscured by pollution. So like London, for example, recently, you couldn't see 2 feet in front of your face. Almost went back to the time before they enacted controls over smog. It has completely obscured the city. And then I have one of Tehran, which is completely polluted, and there's no visibility, and Beijing. So I've saved some of these images thinking, and if I did it, it would be easier because you could hardly see anything in the painting.
Or you might consider Miami or New York City underwater.
Well, I might, but I'm just saying I started picking the imagery.
When you going through the paper in an image, you pick an image. Is there something about the image that grabs you? What is it that you're looking for?
It's something that grabs me about the idea of what I'm looking at more than the image itself, and how I could use it to make a statement about it as a painting where you would confront it. And what we admire about Whistler's Nocturnes was actually that way because London was soaked in poison fog, and people were dying, regularly there. And the artists loved it because it gave this great kind of look of things. Monet used it, because it was all smoky and everything. But really, it was absolutely, they called it fog, but it wasn't fog. There was no fog there. And finally, I don't think they cleaned it up until 1960s because there was a lot of industrial interest that wouldn't allow it. But it had caused, it was so dense sometimes that people would run over people with their carts. They would have to lead the horses. They couldn't see 2 feet in front of them. It was gas. It was smoke from smelters. It was mercury. It was lead. But the artists liked it. But see, I don't like it that much, you see. So I was thinking, how could I do that in some way that it would draw attention to the fact that this is a terrible thing to do. So if I did go back to it, which I don't know if I will yet, that's probably where I would start.
Thank you for coming. I'm enjoying this. I had a couple of questions. One, I wondered if you have ever, or how you've responded, if you've gotten any feedback from people who object to the disasters in that, boats sinking or fires, take lives, and how you would respond to people who are upset by that, maybe even firefighters. I was just struck by that, thinking about firefighters, especially talking about 9/11. So many firefighters died. The other question I wanted to ask, I'll just do 2 for 1, although it doesn't seem like anyone is competing with me, is you mentioned Goya a few times, and I thought it was interesting because I also appreciate Goya, but I think so much of the paintings that he did of, small children and family scenes and plump Spanish women, and so it seems like you were getting something different from Goya. So I'd be interested also in just hearing how Goya or other artists influenced your work.
Well, let's see now. That's a 2-part question. The first part is I've never had anyone complain about that because especially the firefighters, they see it as ennobling. That wasn't my intention to either to make it a noble image or a bad image or an ironic image, but it succeeds in putting them, in their place of being the guardians against chaos. So in a way, I've had them mostly very, very happy about it. I've had people who've seen the Auschwitz picture break down and cry in front of it, but they've never said anything bad to me about it. And the only time I ever had a protest was when I had a painting that was in St. Louis called Polish Landscape, which was really a sort of the beginning of a kind of homespun industrialism in Poland. And they had turned a barn into a factory, and it was spewing, stuff. And so it was like a Turner landscape. It was called Polish Landscape. And somehow a Russian ballet group had gone to see it, and they started complaining that I was, somehow putting down the Soviet Union or the Polish Union in some way, that I was making fun of them, of which it was certainly not my intention. But that's the only time I ever had anybody say anything about it.
And Goya?
Goya, I've only, my involvement with Goya, well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, there's a wonderful painter, But the only use I've used Goya really was, there's a balcony scene that he painted with the Donnas in the veils and the hats overlooking the plaza. And then Manet did the exact same painting, more or less, but with some of his friends. And I used the balconies just as a reminder, a continuation of these different ways of looking historically at balcony paintings. And the colors are muted. I've used a lot more of kind of Manet in a way than Goya, but the 3rd of May painting is really one of the ones that was the direct line, Goya to Manet to these. That was the direct line I used. And then he did those whole etchings of the horrors of war, which would directly go to Matthew Brady. They're small, but they're very interesting, very powerful. And the dark side of Spanish life is revealed in those works. And actually, even in some of his portraits of people, that it's hard to, I don't think that many people think when they think of Spain of the dark side of Spanish life, but there's a very deep black darkness to Spain, and always has been. And if you look at what they did to South America, you can kind of see it. So, no matter how they, what they paint around the Spanish court, Velázquez and all of these people, Velázquez's dwarves, for example, you can imagine what the court must have looked like. Such a strange place. And so there's something about Goya that it does resonate. His black pictures, especially Saturn devouring his children, and the guys buried to their knees with clubs, pounding on each other for eternity, and these kinds of things. So you can see why it would be appealing.
When you look at newspaper photographs, do you ever go back and look at historical newspapers, or are these inspirations, when you were doing the disaster paintings, is it just from the morning's paper?
Yeah.
Talking about Spain, a kind of portrait of Spain, one of the things that you were talking about I found really interesting was that as a kind of composite, you see the disaster paintings as a whole as sort of representing America in some way.
Well, I guess one of the ideas of it is that every structure, every empire eventually will collapse, usually due to its own sense of destruction. And I think partially what we're seeing now, and generally worldwide, I mean, the only thing I can think of is that people, in the West have lived too well for too long, and they just can't stand it. They have to start killing people and start up something. It's too complacent in a way. And it seems historically that's what happens. I mean, if you look at the fall of Rome, it starts with the military takeover and the death of the Republic. And once the military became the big power of Rome, that was the beginning of the end. Along with other things, that's a simplistic viewpoint, but basically that's what happened with the Caesars and the Praetorian Guards and the building of the empire and the people's love of the military. So, I mean, everyone, even though as beautiful and as powerful as that empire was, eventually they did themselves in. So, I mean, we see it, America is kind of different because we do ourselves in practically every 10 years. So there's always a kind of regrowth. It's sort of like setting the prairie on fire and seeing what grows. So I don't know how long it'll last, but we seem to have that. And so these paintings were really about the collapse. They were the dead plants and the steel mills and all of those things that have caused such a disruption across the great parts of the country. So that's one aspect of what those were. They were called plants, dead plants, and so they referred to this architecture as plants. They come and they go. But again, the result is not the thing closing, it's what happens afterwards. That's the catastrophe. And that's something that I think is important to remember.
Hi there.
Hi.
Just on a separate subject, you had painting of Venice. You talked about the London pollution. You mentioned the pollution in Tehran and Bushehr. And I'm an Iranian American. I'm just wondering where you get your inspiration for different cities. Is it from traveling? Is it from newspapers? Or TV news?
Well, these all
or-
come from newspaper pictures.
All
I've
newspaper.
never been to Tehran. I've never been to Iran. I've been to Venice a few times, but never when it didn't have any water in it.
So it's all from newspapers.
Yeah, it's all from when something happens that catches somebody's eye that is there.
And is there any TV news at all, or
No,
video or anything that
I don't-
influences you?
Not really.
Got it. Thank you so much.
I mean, video's too fast. I can't catch it.
Thank you.
Well, I guess that's it. Oh, okay.
Just a quick question about your technique. I was really fascinated to hear you say that you work with a blowtorch. Did you know you would be working with a blowtorch when you put down the tar? How did you come about learning
Oh.
how to work with blowtorches?
Oh, I guess I told this earlier today. When I was working for a gallery on 57th Street, I was looking for a way to make paintings that were physical and had weight to them, because I really like the feeling of physicality more than the illustrative aspect of drawing on a canvas. I like to make it seem like it's physical, you know. And so, I mean, I was doing things sort of like that when I was a graduate student, but it involved pouring plastics and so on out of big buckets of stuff, and I didn't want to lug them up the steps to my loft, so I was trying to find a material that would give me that feeling. And I was working in a gallery, and I went into the elevator, and there were men in there working, laying linoleum on the floor of the elevator. And I said, how do you cut that around the metal disc in the middle that's the key for the brake? And he said, you just heat it up and it gets soft. So I said, well, give me some of those tiles. So they gave me a few tiles. And I went home and I put it on the stove. And it got soft, and I cut out an image and another image, and then I thought, well, that's it. So that's how I learned to do it. And it just got bigger, you know, as time went on. So that's really how that happened. And the funny thing is that when I was sent to do prints in 1979 in Vallauris, France, because some print publisher who was a friend of mine thought I was a natural for linoleum prints. But which really wasn't true. I had no idea how to do linoleum printing or cutting. He said, no, there's a guy in Vallauris who was Picasso's lino cutter. He has a shop there. And, you go there and you just start working. He'll fix you up. So he set me up there, and he sent me over there. And I walked in, and this grumpy Frenchman, basically it was a shop that did theater tickets and posters. He wasn't a printer, really. And he gave me a box of old tools and some linoleum, and he said, go cut linoleum. So I was completely at a loss. I had no idea what to do. So I went out on the porch, and I set them in the sun and then started cutting them. And that was the easy part. The hard part was to figure out then, once I did do that, what was I going to make with it? So the first thing I did was I made images of the cypress tree in front of the house that was topiaried into a kind of shape like that. And I did the first prints, and I looked at it, and I thought, well, this is going to be impressive. I'm going to be sent to the south of France. I'm going to be living in a villa. I'm going to be working with this guy, and I'm going to come back with a picture of a pickle. So that was the first print. So, you know, my life as a linoleum printer was very short.
Any last questions?
Oh, well, again, it was like it was a transition of different images. And if you want to go back before that, we can show her. I started out with morning glories that were growing on the side of my house in France. And they were more or less, I was doing them by hand. I discovered that this color, this ultramarine color I was using, if I put a alizarin crimson under it and then put it on with a lot of solvent, it would dry the color of a bright morning glory. So if you're looking at a morning glory, you've got this center that's white and then the color horn around it. So I made some paintings of that, and then I decided to do a black and white one, so I scraped the tar off as a kind of like a lino cut, and I painted in the, I didn't paint the green leaves, I just painted in the morning glories and then put stickers on there. And I had this painting that was dots. And so I did a whole series from that. You could go to the next one of the oranges coming down. This one was another one, a big one. I did oranges on branches. I took the center out and started working with that. And then that went to this one, the next one that you asked me about. And then that went to this. So there's a lot of series of how to use dots.
It's interesting in relation to one of the paintings that's upstairs as well. I think it's the Vera Cruz with the kind of dots of light.
Right. I hadn't thought of that when I did it, though. I hadn't gotten into the dot stage. But I had not seen that painting in 30 years, so I was looking at it. It's one of the few paintings that I'm so familiar with those paintings. I love those paintings so much, but that one particular one, I didn't remember that I had done these little street lights in there. And normally I wouldn't do that, but I did it. And I was looking at it and thinking, you know, I could not have done that better. And I don't even know how I did that. And I was just staring at it, thinking the rhythms and the amount of them, and everything is just right. So that was actually kind of a thrill to see that painting.
It's great for the art historian as well to connect the dots.
Right.
So thank you so much for, there's one more question, the last question. The question is, how much time and effort have you given to making prints?
A lot of time and effort. I made a lot of prints. I still make a lot of prints. The first grouping of prints I made was a series of etchings called Water Under the Bridge. And they started with a kind of boat on a 1 square piece of copper, 1 foot square, like a tile, and then went through all the permutations of them from that shape that I could think of. And from that, I went on to making more etchings. I made the giant lemon paintings, prints, which I started to use the aquatint, was the first new way of using aquatint since the 19th century. And I used it as a powder so that I could, instead of most aquatints you put down and then you melt, and then you work with it as a stop out and so on and so forth, or many ways of working with it. But this I used as powder, much the way I use charcoal. And I made the image, and I made it we had to build a special press. We made it with roofing copper. So I wanted to continue the whole idea of industrial image making. And I made a lot of prints like that. And then I started getting into having printers use, we did silk screens, we've done a lot of different kinds of images that are, silk screening and lithography and all of these things. What I like about prints, and I'm actually really against monoprints, is that it can be reproduced. It has to be reproducible. And it has to keep its handmade in art quality. It's not just a poster that's stuck together. It's an artwork that has to be, mechanically or manually run through a press, and it has to be pretty consistent. So it goes with the whole concept of industrial working. And I still make a lot of prints. So I can't tell you how much time I do with prints, but it's quite a lot. Lately, most of the prints have been made in New York. The problem that's happening is that most of the etchers and a lot of the great printers are gone now. There's very few shops left that make them. And I'm hoping I found a new one in Providence, Rhode Island, but we'll see.
On behalf of the museum, Mr. Sultan, that's me here, I'd like to thank you very much for your exhibition and for this public program, having a conversation with you. Thank you so much. And I'd like to remind the audience that there is a reception in the Luce Foundation Center on the 3rd floor upstairs. Thank you.
See you all upstairs.
Interesting.